So today we're going to discuss the current statewide campaign for Washington's Office of Superintendent of Public Instruction. Now, this is really just a continuation of my video series providing my pre-primary and pre-filing week analysis of these often overlooked statewide races in Washington State. Now, I've already produced a video series on the Washington State governor's race and a couple videos that address the Attorney General race, and I'll link to those in the video description down below. But for now, let's just dive into the details on this race for who will be elected this November to be in charge of our state's public school system. Now, Washington State has had an elected superintendent of public instruction since statehood in 1889, and this was actually a part of the state constitution since the state's inception. Washington State is one of 12 states that directly elect their head of public schools, not including Oregon next door, which technically gives their governor the title of Superintendent of Public Instruction as one of their official titles as well. Now, for those of you who are state history buffs out there, the first woman ever elected to public office in Washington State was a Republican, Josephine Preston, who's actually pictured right here in 1912, 2 years after Washington State gave women the right to vote, and who actually became the fifth superintendent of public instruction in Washington State, where she remained until she was defeated in an election primary, actually in 1928. Now, there's a strong and understandable historic reason for why Washington State has had the Office of Superintendent of Public Instruction since statehood. In part, this has actually been about money and assets. The largest line item on the Washington State General Fund budget is the cash sent to the public schools, usually over half the budget, which is just tens of millions of dollars. And then, of course, the founders of Washington State set aside a large reserve of public lands that were to be managed in trust for public school construction. Another little odd side note here, the Superintendent of Public Instruction is actually sixth in line to replace the governor in an emergency in kind of a line of succession behind the Lieutenant Governor, Secretary of State, Treasurer, Auditor, and Attorney General. So if you read Washington State Constitution, you will also see that the founders clearly prioritize education as a state priority and imperative, a paramount duty to be exact. And in fact, this might actually be the only phrase of the Washington State Constitution that most Democrats in Washington State have ever read or memorized. So anyway, there's a lot of people running for this statewide office right now this year, and it should be no surprise why this is happening. Now, again, if you want to get a preview for what is happening in state elections or to do some of your own research, I always suggest starting with the Public Disclosure Commission website at pdc.wa.gov. And if you click on the For Voters and Public, and then you click on the Political Disclosure Reports, and then you click on Candidates, and you can actually type in 2024 election and then fill in the blank for whatever office you want to check on. Right now, I want to look at the Superintendent of Public Instruction. And then you're going to actually see all the candidates who have filed to run for the office of the Superintendent of Public Instruction with the Public Disclosure Commission. Now, legally, every candidate who announces that they're running for office in a statewide or local political position in Washington State, they need to file their campaign information with the PDC within a few weeks of their official announcement. Now, I've linked to the PDC website in the video description below as well for those who want to do that kind of research. But right now, if you actually look at the PDC website, you will see 7 candidates running for this office right now. And it does, again, just look just like this. So keep in mind, because I'm producing this video about a month before the official filing deadline, which is the second week in May, it's always possible that some of these guys, they may drop out, or maybe others could jump in. This is one of the often overlooked statewide offices where legitimate candidates often don't have to raise huge amounts of money. Although in a crowded field like this one, money is going to be very important for challengers to inform the voters about their campaign, particularly the essentially 95% of voters who won't be thinking much about this political position at all until they get their primary ballots in the mail next July. Now, unlike my last 2 videos about the governor and attorney general's races, this is actually a political race where we do have an incumbent who's occupying this position. Now, usually an incumbent has so many election campaign advantages that there are typically fewer serious candidates who are willing to challenge them. But in this case, the incumbent is Chris Reykdal, who has failed so spectacularly that his failures and fumbling has encouraged more people to run for this office in a desperate attempt to restore even a modicum of sanity to the public education system of Washington State. Now, Reykdal was originally and tragically elected in 2016, and he's currently in the final months of his second term in this position. He is a hyper-partisan former Democrat legislator from Tumwater who once, years ago, sheepishly kicked me out of a Thurston County Democrat Party public meeting because my very presence emotionally triggered the attendees, at least according to him at the time. Now, Reykdal's primary and exclusive constituency and beneficiary of his political position has been the Washington Education Association Union, and he has eagerly and repeatedly sacrificed the children of our state on kind of the altar of this bloated union's goal. Now, nobody has actually done more to convince parents to get their kids out of the public education system than Chris Reykdal. And he's become a poster child for tens of thousands of families in Washington state who have removed their children from public school over the past 5 years or so. Now, to make things worse, Reykdal has only become more extreme and disconnected from reality the longer he's actually occupied this very well-paid position. And he's been openly mocked by even the government-endorsed media outlets like the Seattle Times for his regular celebration of educational just mediocrity and failures. So this is why he's facing 6 challengers so far and why he hasn't raised the most money in the race at this point. And, of course, this is why his political campaign has been so lackluster. Now, I will point out that during his last election in 2020, in the middle of the COVID chaos, he also had 6 candidates challenging him. But only 2 of those candidates raised any money at all and ran real campaigns. So this year really does appear to be shaping up quite differently. Now, a reminder to my Washington viewers, Washington State has a jungle primary or top 2 primary process, which means that during the August primary, only 2 of these candidates will clear the final hurdle and be on the November ballot. And if you don't understand what a jungle primary is or how it works, again, I've linked to my video from a few years ago like this down below that basically explains the history behind this and how it works today. In addition, you will actually note that there's no party affiliations defined for any of these candidates. And this is because of a citizens' initiative back in 1938 that removed party affiliation from the statewide office itself. Now, Reykdal isn't the only left-leaning candidate in this race. His challengers actually span the spectrum of political affiliations when they're known. And I will start with the candidates who have raised the most money so far in their effort to unseat Reykdal. For context, Reykdal has raised over $100,000 so far, and I'd expect him to kind of raise somewhere between $300,000 to $400,000 just over the next few months. In 2020, for example, he raised $368,000 from leftists, the WA, and then typical political insiders in Olympia and Seattle. Now, the candidate with the biggest cash pile in this race so far, however, is not incumbent Reykdal. It's actually Reed Saris, who has basically raised over $185,000, according to PDC filings so far. Now, at the time that I'm recording this video, that's the current number. Unlike Reykdal, challenger Saris obviously supports highly capable educational programs, and he actually may believe in merit-based education system, which is something that, for example, the Seattle public school system has recently abandoned because it's racist, of course. Now, I don't know Saris personally at all, but when I review his website, large donors, and campaign background, I believe it is safe to say that he's probably a Democrat who might still believe in math and merit, and it just might, maybe, even be possible that he knows what a woman is. There are a few politicians who identify as Democrat who still believe in merit or that math is real, so these distinguishing characteristics might set him apart, even though he's obviously trying to occupy kind of a politically neutral lane in this race. Based on articles and puff pieces like these that have been written about Saris, I believe that he appears to support highly capable educational programs with his involvement with educational opportunities and kind of as a former educator himself. Plus, of course, his Harvard undergrad and Stanford grad degree give him some credibility among the wealthier, semi-sane, insider kind of Democrat voters who reside in the greater King County area. I would expect that Saris represents the greatest threat to Reykdal's political future because he is likely to attract voters who might have plugged their nose and then voted for Reykdal in the past, at least during the primary. So Saris provides an option for voters looking for someone for whom they can vote and then still nominally retain their credentials as a Democrat. Now, by the way, on the vaguely left-leaning or Democrat side of the spectrum in this race, there is at least one other guy, one candidate, who might siphon votes from Reykdal's base. And this is Vincent Perez here, who he's only raised $15,000 so far, but whose donors, employment, and then website clearly paint him as far left on the crazy spectrum. He is the executive director of Rethink Manhood, and and I'm actually assuming that he uses this pronoun, he, but I'm happy to be corrected again if I'm wrong, but his spouse or significant other runs the Equity Institute. Now, I'm not really sure why this guy's running for this political position, but I wish him well, because everyone who votes for him essentially takes a vote from Reykdal, and every dollar that he gets from donors and special interests is essentially thrown away. On the more openly conservative side of the spectrum, which for this political office means that they support merit, math, and reality in public education, there are 3, possibly 4 candidates, really, depending on how you classify conservative in the context of how to run the state's public education system. As always, I'll start with the largest campaign bank account first and then kind of work down from there. So the first is David Olson, who, according to the PDC, has raised over $26,000 and who has been an elected school board member in the Peninsula School District for over 10 years now. He's a retired naval officer. He's been active in Washington State School Director Association policy battles for years, and he is no stranger to the struggle for retaining sanity in the public school system. I've personally known David for years in the activist trenches, and while he hasn't raised as much money as he needs to in order to seriously campaign yet, I have seen him all over the state campaigning for this office. I believe David's greatest challenge will be obviously raising funds and then name recognition around the state. He appears to be working hard to get the Republican primary endorsement at their Spokane convention now in a couple weeks. Next, we have former Republican state legislator Chad Mogendas out of Issaquah, who, according to the PDC, has raised $16,000 so far. Now, Chad, just like David Olson, is also a Navy veteran, 12 years in the submarine service. He graduated with a science degree from Cornell. He worked at Microsoft for 20 years, and he has recently been teaching computer science in the Bellevue School District. I've also known Chad for many years and often spent time discussing educational policy issues with him while he was actually in the state legislature. And he was often in the trenches with me when we had some property rights battles in the King County area in the past. He cut his teeth in public education when he was on the Issaquah School Board, and he was involved in the original math war fight about 20 years ago when the lefties were actually trying to push fuzzy math in the local public schools, and then they wanted to ensure that most kids would never learn any real math again. Now, for those who thought the public education system only recently went off the rails of sanity, you really need to know this has actually been a long fight. And frankly, I am a little surprised that Chad hasn't raised more money for this race so far, considering some of historic fundraising political connections that he does have. And then Chad's biggest challenge, I think, in this race is going to be to expand his network of politicking outside of the Tri-County area of Kings, Snohomish, and Pierce and to the wider Washington State area. The next challenger is Brad Klippert, also a former Republican legislator, in this case out of the 8th Legislative District in eastern Washington, which is kind of in the Tri-Cities area in Benton County. Now, again, this is another legislator that I've spent years in the past discussing and working on many policy issues with, generally in close alignment over the years. I also interviewed him a few years ago during his failed campaign for the Washington State Secretary of State race in 2022, and I'm going to link to that video down below as well. Brad has actually been, he has a background in law enforcement, and he has been a school resource officer for many years. He has a clear passion for kids and a good background in public policy from his time in the state legislature. Like the other 2 openly conservative candidates that I've discussed here, he will clearly need to raise more money to be known around the state. He's really only raised $6,000 so far. And while he is well known in Benton and Franklin counties and kind of that Tri-City area in eastern Washington, he does not have great name recognition on the west side of Washington State. Now, the final and last challenger that I'll discuss today will be David Spring. He's currently from Whatcom County, and David is a Whatcom County, or I should say he's a former Democrat candidate for the Washington State Senate in the 5th Legislative District from years ago, and this is in the Issaquah area. And I actually first met him when he blew the whistle on a Democrat Party bribe scheme that was used successfully at the time to get a Democrat into the 5th state Senate seat. The scandal at the time was it was just this open bribing of former state senator Cheryl Flug with a well-paid, cushy position on the Growth Management Hearings Board, a position for which she was and remains completely unqualified, at just the right time, of course, to prevent the Republicans from replacing her with another candidate option on the ballot. Now, David Spring was the Democrat insider who witnessed and exposed this scheme, which made substantial news at the time. This caused the Democratic Party, of course, to isolate and attack him for exposing the truth about the scheme. Now, over 10 years ago, I remember having some lengthy and wonkish policy education discussions with him, and in several instances, we both testified in favor in opposition to similar bills in Olympia, and I believe we also were in support of several as well. David's biggest challenge is that he has raised zero funds, and he also unsuccessfully ran 4 years ago for the same position, also raising zero funds at the time. The Democratic Party is obviously hostile and angry with him, so they will certainly undermine him, and this fact, combined with the lack of funds, this kind of creates a road to become superintendent of public instruction that's very unclear to me at this point in time, even if we may agree on many policy issues. So this is essentially the lay of the land right now. One of these candidates are probably going to get the endorsement of the Washington State Republican Party at their Spokane convention in a few weeks. I would expect that this endorsement may have an impact on this race in kind of filtering out support for one of the more conservative options on the ballot. Now, it's always harder to raise money for a nonpartisan statewide race from very partisan donors, but perhaps that endorsement could filter out some of these choices. Chris Reykdal has been such an openly mocked and just miserable failure in this position for many years now that his clear weakness has opened challengers and challenges from people who nominally they might agree with his politics otherwise, and we were going to have to wait and see if Reykdal's blundering celebration of mediocrity and failure in combination with the benefit of incumbency will be enough to carry him over the finish line. The Washington Education Association PAC is the 800-pound gorilla in this race. The WA PAC is always the best-funded cash-grifting operation out there, and they're going to keep their gravy train going as long as they can. Reykdal helps them with that process, and this is regardless of how much they harm the children or our state's future. So their goal, the WA's goal, is to extract as much cash-payer tax as they can from the people to fund their own lavish political operation. So they should never be counted out as long as they retain millions of dollars in their account. Now, I'll link to some campaign finance complaints down below and recent fines imposed on this corrupt organization for breaking the law in recent years, and these were based on official complaints that I filed against them. The WA PAC is currently under investigation by the PDC, again, based on some of my complaints. But regardless of any of their lawbreaking, they will try to influence the outcome of the election in this race more than any other, since it directly impacts their cash-grifting operations. Now, the race for the office of Superintendent of Public Instruction is one usually ignored by the general public, and there will not be the same type of expensive ad campaigns that you're going to see for governor and other political positions this year. If Reykdal makes it through the primary with the WA's help, I imagine this will be one of those races where anyone else running against him will be better than the incumbent. But we have to see what happens on August 1st. Regardless of this, if you want to make a difference in this race, you have to show up, either donating to the candidate you want to prevail now, and most particularly in August when your vote will basically have the biggest impact on who survives the top two primary. And this is because, as I always say, the future does belong to those who show up.